Hello. It's good to see all of y'all. Haven't been on this side of Houston in a while. Actually, when I first got married, I was just right down the road in those apartments, and all I heard was Briar Forest just all day long, and it's cool being back. Nice to see all of you. Lorian asked me about a month ago. She said, "Hey, is it possible for you to come and talk to my group?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. What do you want me to talk about?" She said, "It's no big deal. Just the problem of evil." Like, okay. So the biggest argument against God's existence in the history of ever, and no problem, I got an hour, just hash it out a little bit. And so I said, of course. And then I noticed the date, and I was like, did you plan this for election day? So, that's pretty clever. I got to give it to her. I taught her well. Okay, so we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. And then, then I asked her for a little bit of a clarification, as one should do. Are we tackling this more in the philosophical, how does God exist with evil existing, atheistic versus Christian kind of thing? Or are we doing this more along the question of, in Scripture, how do you tell other Christians this is why God is justified in allowing evil? Or how do we deal with this in our Christian worldview? And she said, yes. So that is what we're going to do. I hope you guys are ready to go. I'm a teacher, so if you have any questions, raise your hand. Oh. Now, I've always thrived as a teacher on a little bit of interaction, so if you think I'm full of it, let me know, and we'll hash it out, because you know what? That's what we're here for. So, I have my trusty whiteboard. So we're going to start off, and we're going to ask the question more from a philosophical perspective and justify God's existence from a philosophy point of view, aka if you're talking to an atheist, if you're talking to a non-believer, or even just a general skeptic, they're not really sure what to believe, and they're asking a good question, such as, hey, my fill-in-the-blank died or experienced something horrible, and you say that you follow this good God or whatnot. I mean, how's that? I don't know how to reconcile this. It doesn't make any sense. So many horrible things have happened through the years. Crusades, let's throw that one out there. You know, like all of these things that would be hot-button issues that people just generally bring up, and we sit here and squirm around a little bit because we're like, yeah, that's I've been wondering about that myself, to be honest with you. Okay, I'm going to take it from the philosophical side of things first, and then we're going to move into the theological side. So we'll be outside of the Christian prism, if you will, and then we'll jump into the side of the Christian prism. And I think it'll make more sense that way. That's usually how I like to talk about it. So let's start off with the actual argument as it's given in philosophical circles. And in order to do that, it's helpful to have just a real quick understanding, just for anyone who's maybe not terribly familiar with this. It would be a logical argument, in which case it would be following general logical principles. So, have you ever heard of the phrase, mind your P's and Q's? Yeah, it's kind of funny, but in logic, we actually use literally P's and Q's. So we would say something like, if P, can y'all see this? Then Q. So say that this is a premise that we would give, and we're trying to make a truth statement. If P is true, then Q must also be true. And so this is kind of the foundation of what we'll be starting with. All right, well, how do we determine then if we have a logical deduction that would be true based upon this premise that I've kind of thrown out here? And these can stand for anything. So what does P stand for if it's raining outside? What does Q stand for? Then the ground is wet. Okay, so if we take the premise, if P then Q, if it's raining outside, then the ground will be wet, then you can start using logical deductions to conclude if you have a valid argument or whatever else. So if I were to say, well, the ground is wet, so therefore it must be raining outside. Maybe that would be a logical deduction that we make. And we can make good ones, we can make bad ones, we can make confusing ones, more than often confusing. But in this instance, if it is raining outside, then the ground will be wet. Well, the ground is wet, therefore it must have rained. Is that a good conclusion? No, of course not. What could have happened that would cause the ground to be wet? Sprinkler, very good. What about this? What if I were to say, if it's raining outside, then the ground will be wet. The ground is not wet, therefore it could not have rained. Is that valid? Why not? Say what? Okay, so it's covered with a roof, except if we accept that this is true by default, if this is our starting point that has to be true, just hypothetically, then technically it would be valid. It's a type of, it's called modus tollens. Like whenever we do something in logic, we like to use Latin words so that everyone just stops asking questions. Anyway, it's actually valid to say, if the ground is not wet, then it could not have been raining, so long as this is correct. Anyway, why am I bringing this really boring topic up? The reason I am is because the argument that is typically given to prove God does not exist based upon evil follows a modus tollens schematic. So let me go ahead and let's work through this argument and let's see if this makes sense, and let's see kind of where the weaknesses may lie in this. So let's go on to something that is far more interesting. And we're going to write this out. We'll do it with numerical statements here. So we're going to start off with God is, you know what? We'll use the generic term here. God is omni, fill in the blank. This will imply omnipotent, which means all-powerful. So omni meaning all, potent, power. Exactly. It's pretty straightforward. He is also omnibenevolent, is what Christians would say, right? He is the definition of good. He gets to define everything that is good. So he is omnibenevolent. He is omniscient, knows everything, right? Would these all, I would assume that these would all be accepted statements within the Christian community because, well, as a Christian, I believe these things, right? It just makes logical sense. If he created literally everything, then he is omni, all of these things. Do we have agreement? I see a lot of head shaking. Good. All right. Well, the argument then goes, God is, we'll take omnipotent. So, all power, right? God is omnipotent and thus could, get rid of all evil. Do we agree that omnipotence means God even has the power to eradicate evil if he so chose? Seems to be I'm not having a problem with this argument thus far, so cool. All right, so let's go to point number 3. God is omni-good. I altered that from omnibenevolent. It'll matter in a second. But God is omni-good and thus would want to get rid of all evil. Is that a fair statement? Okay, why not? This is true. And so what you've done is you've hit upon one of the counter-arguments that you would see even all the way back from Anselm and some others. Oh, I'm sorry. She said you don't know essentially what is the justification for what God is allowing it for. So for instance, I may spank my kid, or I may ground my kid, or whatever it is I may do to my kid throughout history. Well, you might call that an evil action, depending upon the circumstances, but what if it brings about a greater good? Well, then maybe it's justified. And so what she's saying is, well, God could be justified in doing this if it brings about a greater good or something like that. Typically call it a greater good argument. And it's a good argument. It's been useful for the years, certainly. And there are other ways in which you could challenge something like this. Like you might say the free will argument, where God has self-limited himself, which sounds very strange. But he did it so that humans could have free will and make their choices because he doesn't want robots, right? And so therefore that would be a justification on point number 3, at least in this perspective. Yes? Yes. So, yeah, and that's a good point as well. Would he want to if he is all good? And there's a reason why typically you're going to phrase it this way. You know that you're dealing with an atheist who kind of knows their game because they're going to put the want, because it's definitional. In other words, if God is good, then he would want to eradicate anti-himself. Is kind of philosophically where he's going with this. That's a good, definitely a good point. Would he get rid of evil? Well, I mean, he may or he may not. It could just be incidental at best, in which case this argument would fail. But he would want to because it would be anti-himself, is where they're going to go with this. Does that make sense? Excellent question. Okay, so our argument is proceeding. God is omni-everything. An omnipotent God could get rid of evil, and no one's challenged that point. An omni-good God would want to get rid of all evil, and that's actually the key. Again, not to belabor the point, but by putting would want, that is definitional. In other words, this premise is self-affirming. If you say he would not want to, or he simply would ignore it, then you would not be able to define him as omni-good, because it is self-affirming. It's very clever, is it not? Logic can be fun, it could be irritating, it could be all kinds of things. So then we move on, and this is the crux of it right here, evil exists. So if you have a God who is all-powerful, could get rid of evil, if you have a God who is all good, would want to get rid of all evil, and yet evil still exists, then your only conclusion, in logic you make 3 dots, and that's somehow supposed to indicate a conclusion. Therefore, God cannot exist. Now, this can be modified in a couple of ways. So, for instance, it's not just that God doesn't exist and therefore we proved it. It's either God as defined can't exist, or you can modify his definition and he can still exist. So for instance, if you want to call him not all-powerful, so maybe he's a Greek god or something like that, well then sure, this argument wouldn't disprove Hercules, it wouldn't disprove Zeus, but it would disprove an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God. And so this is where you will kind of see this argument all form together, and Christians immediately go, okay, this just got out of hand very quickly. And the funny thing about this argument is it's not formally invalid. Here's what I mean by formally invalid. Remember when I was talking about the if P then Q, and then we kind of went through different options? Well, there are fallacies that can be created by reversing them or saying, well, P is not Q, therefore Q is also not true, things like that. Affirming the consequent is a fallacy, denying the antecedent. Doesn't matter what they are, but the fact is that the form itself of the argument can actually make the argument invalid. This is not what's happening here. There is no formal fallacy in this argument. The form is correct. It is a modus tollens. It actually works. Well, dang it. Okay, so is there another problem with this argument as presented in just about every philosophical journal over the last 100 years? I would argue yes, there is, and so would a number of other Christians, including C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis actually has an entire book, Mere Christianity, that really kind of hits in on a lot of the problems with this particular argument, and I really appreciate how he did it. And there have been other theologians that have done it as well. And let me kind of walk you through the best way to kind of really critique this, at least in my opinion and in my experience, which other people have different experiences that could be good for them as well. So you think of this as one arrow in your quiver, and it can actually help, if you do it right, it can get you into a discussion with a non-believer that could actually turn out to be extraordinarily helpful in the future. Again, if you do it right, don't let it be a shouting match. This is just simply a question of, all right, is this a valid logical argument? I acknowledge that you have a really good question that I struggle with myself, and I have answers for that. We'll get to them. But you just presented something to me that says, if this is true, God literally can't exist. It's illogical to say he exists. If this argument is true, you would be irrational to say that he exists. It would be like trying to call a car an airplane. Well, I guess we're moving into a new world, so maybe they can be the same thing. It would be like trying to say, oh, I'm an atheist Christian, or I am a seagull. Well, no, you would be irrational by saying those things, right? In the same way, if this argument is true, you are irrational to say God exists. So let's go through this. And one of the things that you'll learn in Logic 101 is everything depends upon definitions. If you haven't done your definitions well, you don't actually have an argument. So for instance, if I say, exists, would you agree with me? Oh, exactly. What's Well, it's And if I use to define then surely I'm right? Now I'm crazy. And you're looking at me exactly like you should. Like this guy's lost his mind. Lorian, what were you thinking? Well, in the same way, if you don't have definitions, or if your definitions drift, then your argument drifts and falls apart very quickly. And I'll give you a couple of examples. In honor of Election Day, let's say that I made the argument, this country is a democracy, not a republic. Therefore, we should all vote Democratic. Or if I say, this country is actually a republic, not a true democracy. Therefore, we should all vote Republican. Whichever side of the aisle you're on, you're going to look at me and chuckle like you're doing now, because I'm worth chuckling at this point. Because that's not what that means. It's called the fallacy of equivocation. It's an informal fallacy, which means the structure can be right, but you got some information wrong inside of it, which causes it to fall apart. So my argument is that this is an informal fallacy. And matter of fact, informal fallacies can be very insidious too. For instance, I can say the same phrase 4 times with the exact same word, emphasize a different word each time, and change the implied meaning. So, we should not speak ill of the dead. That's my phrase. We should not speak ill of the dead. And the assumption is, but someone else can. We should not speak ill of the dead, but we're going to anyway. We should not speak ill of the dead. We can think it. We should not speak ill of the dead. That's what we believe in America. Shouldn't speak ill of the dead. The living, we should speak ill of. Right? And so I said the same sentence 4 different times. It's like a fallacy of accent. The words you accent can even change the meaning and mess up your entire argument. And this is one of the things that you learn in logic class is you have to be insanely precise. If you're going to come to an absolute conclusion, you have to be insanely precise, and it has to apply perfectly in the entire scenario. So let's live by those rules, and let's assess this argument again. Do we even know these definitions? Okay, definition of God, we will use, this. He's omni-everything, all-powerful, etc., right? I can work with that definition. I'm a Christian. Of course I can work with that definition, right? And I think the atheist agrees with this. That's why he's using this argument. So God is omnipotent, all-powerful, and thus could get rid of all. Well, now that's an interesting word, isn't it? What does that word mean? Because I could talk to 10 different people and get 10 different answers, couldn't I? I could talk to the atheist and have an answer, and I could talk to the Christian and get a radically different answer. I could talk to the Levitical priest and get some really interesting answers compared to what I'm used to now, right? Did I shave my sideburns? Because I might not be in compliance with Levitical law. That would be evil, and I would get stoned, as I heard last night, because my wife is listening to the whole Bible, and that happened to be what she's in right now is Leviticus. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I forgot how insane this was. So evil is kind of a drifting definition, isn't it? And if you're an atheist, is there such a thing as evil? Or is there just a thing as what I prefer or don't prefer? I mean, heck, some Christians, it kind of boils down to what we prefer as well, doesn't it? I don't know if you have Twitter, but if you have Twitter, I mean, you'll see 1,000 different definitions of evil, and all of them are adamant about their definitions. It's chaos, is it not? I can define chaos only as a lack of order, but how do I define evil? As a Christian, I would call evil anything that is against what God declares or what he wills. It's a pretty simple definition, right? But an atheist doesn't believe in God. There is no God to an atheist. So what's the definition of evil? It's also going to be a problem with omni-good, is it not? How do you define good? Can I have a working definition that will actually satisfy the rules of logic? Well, to be fair, there have been a number of attempts to try and do this well, one of which that I would argue is the most scholarly would be by a guy named William Rowe. He's a philosophy professor. And he tries to give a specific definition for evil, would be intense suffering with no justifiable ends, if you will. In other words, there's nothing that justifies the intense suffering. Okay, well, I think we would all agree that that would be evil, but here's the problem. Who gets to justify if it was worth it? Right? I mean, if there's a resurrection of the dead, it kind of changes the rules for an atheist, doesn't it? If God declares it's worth it, then isn't it? If he is this? You see what I mean? And so even the most accurate scholarly definition that has ever been presented turns into a judgment call. I think this is bad, evil. I dislike this. You're exactly right. As a matter of fact, that's really what it boils down to. We all came to a conclusion, or at least most of us, as society, we came to a conclusion of what we like and what we don't like. And yes, we recognize that definition drifts, but we're convinced that it's true this time. That's what we call good and evil. In which case, doesn't this argument then read, God is all-powerful and thus could get rid of everything that we don't like? God is all about what we like and thus would want to get rid of everything we don't like. But that stuff we don't like exists. Therefore, he doesn't. Until you, and this is what's so funny about it, is it's hilarious when you say it this way, right? And yet that's exactly what's happening, because that is the definition that is given. Once you push it far enough to an absolute definition, like a physicist would demand, you're stuck with just a bunch of goofiness. And so it sounds like such a compelling argument, right up until the laws of logic demand that you actually define terms, and then you realize, this is really just, I'm angry about this. Fair enough, I am too, but that doesn't make it irrational to believe in God's existence. You have a question? Maybe excellent question. Mm-hmm. Yes. And that, again, you're exactly right. That's exactly the next move. But here's the problem. That works great right up until you walk up to the serial killer, who thinks it's actually quite all right. Or you walk up to the person in trench warfare who's getting attacked by the Germans, and we justify by calling it not murder, but killing, or state-sanctioned, right? Now, I'm not saying whether it's okay or not under God's law. That's not my point today. But the fact is that you have to get universal acceptance among all humans at all times, right? Otherwise, it's still a judgment call, because you said everyone would agree. Well, no, everyone's never going to agree. But even if everyone did agree, even if every single human being alive agreed, do we get to dictate what is good and evil versus omnipotence? If an omnipotent God exists, would we get the ability to dictate good and evil? Which is really interesting, because the next move will inevitably boil down to this, in my experience. The atheist will say, all right, well, let's take your definitions of good and evil. Does your God say evil exists? To which I will say, yes, read Leviticus. And, well, heck, read the New Testament too, but they'll say, okay, so does your God describe himself, or do you describe God as good? Well, of course. Well, how does that even work out? Even in your own religion, it doesn't work out, because evil still exists, right? But see, here's the problem, is that I don't think that any of us have really taken the term omnipotence to its obvious conclusion. We all kind of ignore this. What we have a habit of doing, Christians and non-Christians alike, is we have these categories known as good and evil. And these two categories in our minds exist above and beyond anything, including God. God plays by the rules dictated by good and evil. He just happens to side with this one and not that one. And then he gives that down to the world. Because if we're going to sit here and say that we can judge his existence based upon the categories of good and evil that, again, we can't actually define, then we're actually judging if he is following the rules that we like. That's a categorical error because you have to deal with omnipotence. So what you really said was, this is a demigod, and these are the two deities. Opposite deities, fighting an eternal battle for supremacy, if you will, in which case we believe in the ancient religion of Manichaeism. But Manichaeism is not true, and it's actually logically incoherent, as we see with the laws of logic. Actually, the way that it should look would be reversed, because one of these things is omnipotent, and if you're a theist, a monotheist, which Christianity falls under monotheism, so does Islam, so does Judaism, not making a judgment on validity or invalidity of them, it's just a point of monotheism. You believe in omnipotence, which you simply wrap up in the container called God. Omnipotence means literally can do anything. Anything. It doesn't matter what it is. If he wants to reverse the laws of logic, have at it. He can do it. That's what omnipotence means. He dictates categories of good and evil, if I could spell. And those categories are then applied to the world. As an omnipotent being, if he wanted to reverse those categories, if he wanted to change them, if he wanted to alter them with space and time as he saw fit, nothing's stopping him because he's omnipotent. He can do anything at any time for all time. Which case, again, we all agree this has to be evil, but that doesn't mean anything to omnipotence. And even when you jump into the Christian worldview and try and do it's called a tactic called reductio ad absurdum, which means reduce it to the absurd. So you look inside of the worldview and deconstruct it in on itself. If you can do it successfully, then sure, the worldview falls apart. It's actually a valid logical critique. But the reductio stops with omnipotence. You can't actually proceed any further from a logical argument. And you certainly cannot say it's irrational to say God exists. Now, mind you, we haven't proven God exists. That's a far cry from what we've done. All we've done thus far is done a logical inquiry into the question of, does evil disprove God's existence from a philosophical perspective? And the answer is no. In fact, it's not definable, and the argument deconstructs on itself. And so you're at neutral ground. God may exist. He may not exist. We can still be friends, atheist, right? And this is what I mean by trying to approach this from a perspective of, hey, we're still friends at the end of this. This opens up great conversations in the future. You said that I was irrational. I realize you didn't realize you were saying that, but you kind of called me irrational, so I had to say something. Okay? So are we cool? We good? Okay. But the question still remains, and this is where we transition to theology. The question still remains, yeah, but God still lets horrible things happen. How does that make any sense? Okay, that's a fair question. I had leukemia when I was 19. Parents went through, you know what, it sucked. It was 2 years of my life that it was rough. I've known people who have died from cancer. I've known people who have been in the community, and it's just a very tough place to be. And a good, valid question to ask as a Christian is, why does God let this stuff happen? Didn't Chris say that God is omnipotent and he could stop it right here, right now? There's no reason why this has to happen. Come on, God, get on it. And all the logical arguments in the world aren't going to make me feel better about that, right? Because those are valuable feelings. Those are things that humans feel. Like if you lose a child, if you lose a parent, whatever it is, that is tough, and it should not be minimized. And so the question then really boils down to, Why should we as Christians trust God when he allows this bad stuff to happen? How do we solve this paradox? Because it just doesn't make a lot of sense. To which a theologian and philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, or others like Van Til, would say, well, believe it or not, as crazy as this sounds, this really is the best of all possible worlds. And it's not because necessarily he allowed for human free will or didn't allow for human free will. That's just a byproduct of it. But it has everything to do with the nature of his being. Okay, that sounds very strange. What in the world do I mean by that? Here's what I mean by it. If you've read Matthew, you've certainly come across the Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are all of these people who happen to be the wrong people in the Jewish world at that time, right? Blessed are, the Luke passage that actually parallels this, even says, blessed are the poor. These are the people that they don't have anything. And it's not like they got a middle class either. It's not like they can, at least go home and put their hat up and have some AC and, go to sleep on a bed. Their life stinks in every possible way. But blessed are all of them. Blessed are the people who are persecuted. Why? Because the kingdom is here and it's here for them. And there's something powerful that happens in stories where the wrong is made right. Where a king has such a heart for the people who are struggling that he's willing to lay down his life for them. There's something powerful about thinking about the fact that Jesus is the fullest representation of God according to Scripture. The fullest representation of God. God in the flesh, right? Well, what was the heart of Jesus? The heart of Jesus was reconciliation. It was redemption. The greatest stories that we ever watch are redemption stories, are they not? They're the ones that really tug you in because we can actually see ourselves in it in many ways. Redemption, reconciliation stories, that seems to be the heart of Jesus, which would, again, be the heart of God itself. And he's omnipotent. He gets to dictate what good stories are. If that's his heart, and by the way, if resurrection of the dead happens to be a thing, because he rose from the dead, he says he's bringing a new heavens and a new earth. He is making all wrongs right. Well, what kind of a world do you have to have in order for reconciliation and redemption to be the greatest story of all, the eternal story that means everything? What kind of a story do you have to tell in order to end up with God himself dying on a cross for his people? For the sake of the world. You have to tell a story with evil. You just do. You have to tell a story where people need redemption, right? You have to tell a story where the king self-sacrificing is the greatest story ever told. That's it. That's the story right there. Jesus was always going to end up on a cross. Why? Because God's all-powerful and he said so. Why is Jesus going to end up on a cross? Because redemption and reconciliation, fixing all the broken things and making it greater than it ever could have been before. That's the greatest story. Why do we have evil? Why do these evil things happen? Why did I end up with leukemia? Because it actually is the greatest story, even though it looks like the worst right now. Some of the best stories I've ever read, seen, are the stories that were terrible in the middle. Right? You ever seen a movie that you're watching and you're thinking to yourself, why am I watching this? This is idiotic. I'm wasting my time. That's a solid hour and a half that I'm never going to get back. And then at the very end you go, greatest movie ever. What just happened? Holy cow, I have to rewatch this. Right? Now, again, I'm not trying to say that, the twist ending is what God's going for. But what I'm trying to say is it's really difficult to judge the story quality while you happen to be halfway through it, in the middle of the story. At the end of the day, we do know how it ends, right? It ends with victory of God. It's already been won. The question is, when does everyone get to see it? When does Jesus return? When does he actually make all wrongs right? And so that would be what C.S. Lewis would present. It's what I present as well, as the justification to a Christian for the evil in this world from inside the Christian faith. We've already got an omnipotent God, so if he says it's worth it, it's already worth it. So that the logic's taken care of. It's done. And it doesn't make me feel a lot better to think about it logically. But at the same time, it does kind of make me feel a little bit better in pressing on when I know that my King, at the heart of his story, is redemption and reconciliation. It doesn't matter how far gone you are. It doesn't matter how bad you've been. It doesn't matter who you are. You are his child, and he is here for you. And yeah, it's going to stink for a while. I mean, look at the early church. That's some serious persecution, right? We'll never experience most of that kind of stuff, I don't think. I hope not. But to know that the King is making all things right, just give him time. Have patience. The logic is there. And at the same time, you can see it with Jesus on the cross and the resurrection of the dead. That gives me hope. That gives me faith. And within the Christian faith, it actually is a narrative that makes a lot of sense. Not only does it echo just instinctually what I've experienced in my life, it also satisfies the laws of logic. And it's kind of a cohesive vision for why evil? Why do we have these evil things when we have a good God? To which, I respond, because this is the best possible world, as crazy as that sounds, why you're stuck in the story. Yes?
So is the argument for our having freedom a weaker logic argument in the sense of, like, in my mind, I go back to, well, if he was omnipotent, then there wouldn't be evil for him to correct, unless there's the argument of, well, there's evil because of our because love is defined by freedom.
Maybe.
So, you see what I'm saying? Like, what do you do if someone gets stuck on that point?
That's an excellent question. I would dispute love is defined by freedom.
Okay.
I can love inanimate things. They are neither free nor not free. We could debate how free something is or isn't. I would say this, though. The freedom argument is a popular argument, without a doubt. I have grown to not like the freedom argument, and here's why. Because I've run into several situations where I've seen that argument get a response from a very clever person on the other side who says, well, you said God's all-powerful, right? Yeah. Couldn't he make and define free will as free, but always choose his will? And you say, well, no, that wouldn't be free will. Well, if he's omnipotent, which you already said he is, then he could certainly do whatever he wants, and free will would be completely free and always choosing good. Technically that's correct. From a logical perspective, if you define omnipotence as able to do anything, then you have to be okay with the outcome of able to do anything. And yes, making free will, always freely choose him, would technically be true, or a potential for him. Did that answer your question?
What do you do with the fact that then he seems not omnipotent because there's still evil? Like, I'm psyched that he's going to fix the story. Like, don't get me wrong. And it's and I've made my peace with it, but I'm trying to follow what someone else
Sure. No, absolutely.
would say. I know that most people base this argument on their own suffering, and they define evil based on what causes them pain. So I know that there's that offshoot that's different, but going just back to the how can there be evil if he's omnipotent?
Excellent question. At the end of the day, once you say God is omnipotent, Irenaeus kind of pointed this out indirectly many, many years ago. At the end of the day, you are accepting the fact that God has allowed evil to be a necessary part of his created order at this point in time. I mean, again, when I say that this is the best of all possible worlds, evil is necessary to have redemption. It is necessary, one second. Evil is necessary to have redemption. Evil is necessary in order to actually have reconciliation. And so while it is terrible for us to see this in real time, stuck in the middle of the story, I mean, yeah, it's terrible. We'll all deal with it. But I mean, I would hearken back to a lot of the things that the early Christians said when they were in the gladiatorial rings. One of the big arguments, one of the big things that would really irritate a lot of the Roman officials is, I mean, this is brutal, but the Christian would stand there and they'd say, recant, or I'll cut your arm off. And they'll say, do it. I'm just getting it back. You cannot do anything to me that God has not foreordained and that he is not going to receive and make right. The end. It's, in other words, omnipotence is not broken just because it allows a world with evil. Because omnipotence says it is necessary for you to go through this. It is necessary for the greatest outcome of all that I have predetermined. And you have free choice all along that, but at the end of the day, you're going to be in the kingdom of God, and you're going to look at me and you're going to go, yeah, it was kind of worth it. And I don't know what that looks like. I have no idea. But if we accept omnipotence, then you have to accept everything is at least allowed by him as the best possible solution in some way. Does that make sense? It's an excellent question. Yes?
Hello? Okay. So I'm kind of going a little bit backwards, but at one point you said, so we still, going back to the original philosophical argument part, we still didn't prove God's existence, we just disproved that argument.
Yes.
But did we do that because we couldn't, because no one can agree on the definition of evil?
We did it because there is no definition of evil in what I would call mixed company.
Right.
So in other words, in a Christian perspective, evil is very simple to provide a definition for. But when you're dealing in an atheistic worldview, there is no definition of evil. So you might as well be talking about an amorphic nothing.
Right. So, but if we go from ground zero and someone presents this argument to us, does that mean that these 4 points are invalid?
What you've done is you've actually showed that the conclusion is invalid because the points are incoherent. In other words, the points are self-refuting, and so you can't have a conclusion.
Okay. But you're saying in that a lot of people will come up with these points. Is that why you brought these 4 points up? That this is kind of like a standard.
This is the classical argument against God's. What I did and what I like to do whenever I do apologetics is I like to present the argument against my position in the best possible light, in the most. I like to present atheism in favor of atheism better than any atheist I've ever met can do it.
No, I love that. I mean, I'm not really up on logical arguments, I guess.
That's quite all right.
So this is all new to me.
If honestly, if you take nothing else from the first half of this, it's to just keep asking questions. I can't tell you how many times I will find people who they'll hear some words that sound like they're coming with authority about something, and they'll just accept the conclusion, no matter how crazy the conclusion may be. And it's because they didn't just go, hold on. I know I may think like a 5-year-old here, but every logical argument should be able to be understood by a 5-year-old at the core of its existence. You just have to define some terms for me, and we could just break it down into little pieces, and that's okay. And if it can't be done, if there's some sort of a leap that it sounds like they're making, don't let them make it. Just let's calm down. Let's walk through that again, because I cannot tell you. Put it to you this way. This is going to sound completely irrelevant, but it's not. I'm a big Air Force nerd. I love fighter jets. I don't know why. I've just the engineering, just the whole air just shakes around you when an afterburning jet fighter goes past. It's mind-blowing. And there's the greatest fighter jet ever made is the F-22 Raptor. It's like frontline fighter, stealth jet. I mean, it is amazing. Literally millions of lines of code. goes into just making this jet fly. If the computer that runs the jet, there's actually multiple, but whatever. If they all fail at the same time, because of a computer glitch, one line of code, just one, the whole jet would disintegrate in the sky because it's made inherently unstable. It would flip over and fall apart instantly in less than a second. And so you're thinking to yourself, 4 million lines of code, do you really have to get it all right? I mean, that's pretty insane and complicated. Well, one F-22, and early on in the career of the F-22, the whole system just rebooted like a Windows 95 system, just shut down, screens went off, and he's up there going, I'm at 20,000 feet moving at Mach 1. And I'm rebooting my plane. Thankfully, there's a backup to the backup to the backup that just all it did was just keep the plane flying straight. Millions of lines of code, and all it took was just one little error that any novice engineer could have found if they had just looked through it again, and that brought down the entire jet, right? In the same way, when you're dealing with logical arguments, it doesn't have to be one sweeping, grandiose move. Just define this term for me again, because even just that little tiny thing can bring down an entire argument, and they're called logicians, logic studiers, they're called logicians. Anyway, any logician will point that out. The greatest argument failures have always been just one little word. That's how it always happens. I hope that made sense.
Along those lines, if Christians defined evil as anything against what God declares, like you said, would that argument then work?
Well, that's the argument that is typically made by an atheist who is now moving to stage 2, which is to reductio. In other words, go into the Christian worldview and then make it fall apart from the inside. So in other words, your own viewpoint is incoherent because you say your God's all good, and yet evil exists. And he's the one that determines evil, and he still says it exists. Except, I don't know if you've ever heard of the ontological argument for God's existence. That's a story for a different day, but it all boils down to the question of omnipotence. Once you accept, even in a reductio argument, once you've accepted a definition of omnipotence, you're in a different category altogether. Because if an omnipotent being, if you call him good, it's not because he fits a criteria. It's because he simply says so. In other words, God is good. Why? Because anything he does as an omnipotent being is literally defined as good. He could eradicate all of life on a whim, and it's still technically good simply because of the definition of omnipotence. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, we have preferences, God has absolutes, and it's not because he creates the absolutes, it's because he simply is the absolute. That's the consequence of omnipotence. And honestly, most Christians they really don't think that deeply about that, and I think they should, because you end up with a God who is, this is way crazier than I thought. I mean, omnipotence? Are you serious? Can literally do anything. I mean, contradictory things. He can do that too, because that's what omnipotent means. And when you take it seriously and you force an atheist doing a reductio argument to take it seriously, anything that they're saying at that point is falling apart because you accept omnipotence, well, everything makes sense at this point. It is definitely not fair. In fact, I talked about the ontological argument. I'm not going to get into it now. I'll let you look that up later. It's like mind-blowing. And most people are going to look at it and say, well, that's really stupid. That's like circular reasoning. And yet, for 1,000 years, just God exists. Why? Because his mere definition dictates his existence. That's kind of the sneak peek in the ontological argument. It's hilarious because one of the greatest atheists in the history of atheists, Bertrand Russell, at one point in time in his logical studies, as he was going through his PhD, actually, there's a phrase he's attributed to him. It says, "Great God in boots, the ontological argument's valid." Well, this is way back in the day, and he's British, so that made sense. But even he recognized the argument is actually sound. Now, he's still an atheist because he still thinks that there's got to be something wrong with it. I can't accept that. But this is what omnipotence does to our minds. Like, when you take it seriously, for 1,000 years, the ontological argument has captured the minds of people. Even today, they're into modal logic. We're just doing logic, and they're into, like, modal logic. I mean, if I showed you this, it looks like another language just for pages. It's insane, and yet, it technically is still a valid thing. God's existence is self-evident. simply because of omnipotence. But that's a whole different crazy discussion. But yeah, omnipotence it's a big deal. Yes?
So on the idea that this story is the best story, redemption, right? Very compelling. How do you account for the fall, or how do you? Because I could see even in a Christian circle being like, well, is it the best? Wasn't the best story kind of the first few days, and now we're in the kind of not as great story? So how would you incorporate the fall into that story?
Excellent question. And there are two layers to the answer that I'll give. Layer number one, if God is omnipotent and he let it happen, it's already best. By definition. But that's the easy way out. The hard way out that I would follow, that I would express, would be this. Let's say, hypothetically, I'm going to give you 3 stories. Same person involved in all 3 stories, and it's dealing in war, but it hopefully can illustrate the point. Don't push it to its complete end. It's more just to illustrate the idea. So, person A goes into a war, goes through boot camp, struggles with this person's best friend through boot camp, and they go and fight in the war together, and then they leave after the war, when their tour is over. They have a bond because of the experience, right? I mean, obviously, we've all seen, Saving Private Ryan. We understand the concept of lived experience creates a bond. There's a relationship that you couldn't have without the war, right? Okay, story number 2. You go through boot camp, you go into the war, and your buddy saves your life. Like, you're about to get shot, and they take out the bad guy. Literally saves your life. You owe your life to this person, to your friend. There's a deeper bond that did not exist before and could not have existed in story number 1. Would you agree? And then number 3, you're in a foxhole, you're fighting the war with your buddy, grenade comes flying in, buddy jumps on it, blows up, kills your buddy, saves your life. Different kind of relationship at that point. Like I have to live my life in honor of this person. Like, there's no other way I can live, right? Tragic story all the way around, because war is always tragic. But it should illustrate the idea of there are things that you just can't experience. There's dedication to virtue. There's just a dedication and understanding of a kingdom of God and the heart of God that just cannot be comprehended without things happening in a way that maybe we don't prefer. You know what I mean? So, and I would go kind of, to a certain degree, with the grenade idea of, God himself on a cross? Really? Like, you talk about an apocalypse. That's about as apocalyptic as it gets. God himself dying on a cross just because of us. Because he says, yep, not good enough. We're going to fix this. I'm going to go ahead and be tortured and die for you. The level of devotion that it gave to his disciples is like nothing that you'll ever see anywhere else. 2,000 years later, here we are talking about it still, right? That's a level of devotion that even in the world they look at and first call crazy, but second, it's kind of respect. Yeah, respect. You're committed. All right. It's a story that you can't tell otherwise. Like, it's just, without evil, you don't have that story. If the heart of God, at the core of his omnipotent being, is redemption and reconciliation, you have to have a story where that happens, which means you will have a fall. Irenaeus, I talked about him earlier, he also kind of sketched out this idea. He's a church theologian thousands of years ago. Okay, so it's not plural thousands. It's like 1,800, 1,700 years? Yeah, European. Anyway, and so Irenaeus, the way he described it was this. If the point of the story of God and his creation was at the beginning, then it'd be kind of a limited world in many ways. Like, he creates everything here, and he doesn't describe it as perfect, right? In Hebrew, it's not really indicated that way. It's good. It is the way that he wished it to be. It is good. And he gave Adam tasks and all this kind of stuff, right? Name the animals, build my kingdom. There's clearly a goal in mind. He doesn't have knowledge from the tree of good and evil. There's some missing information. There's a lot of missing things happening there. But it seems like, yeah, the fall's a bad thing. No doubt about it. If this is the perfection line, if you will, right? So we start here, fall, well, that stinks. And we're on this slow move up, right? Maybe the cross is right here, or however you want to arbitrarily draw it. But the goal is not here, because I hate to break it to you, but we understand the heart of God in Jesus better than Adam, better than Abraham. And they talked to him straight face to face. But they didn't see Jesus on a cross. We know him better. We know his heart, his motivation, what he's going for. We know more than they did, than they ever could. And so the goal seems to be far more than just that. And I know we, at least in the Baptist tradition, it's been drawn out like, right, and you put a cross right here, and or whatever, right? And so we're here, and God's over here, and toss a line, and Jesus bridges the whole gospel story thing. But that sure seems like a waste of time. It seems like a kink in the system where God says, "Duh, I didn't see that coming. All right, plan B. Jesus, get on. Let's go. They're going to walk on your back, and we're going to get to the other side here." But that's not what's presented in Scripture at all, right? I mean, if this is truly God's story and it's all about redemption and it's about we're going somewhere and he's building his kingdom and the fall is not good enough, it's going to get done whether you like it or not. Here comes Jesus, we're going to die on the cross, and now you are going to be finishing the job I gave you, and this creation is going to be awesome. Well, then we're going somewhere, and it's going to be a whole lot better than just that. So that's the story that I would fall with. I agree with the Iron Man position on this.
I guess I'm going to get back to my "it's not fair" argument on your omnipotence, because to me it devalues God on a cross. Since God is omnipotent, what does his death mean? It means nothing, because it's easy for him to conquer death. So why do we care whether he chose to die or not to die? Since it doesn't mean anything to God, he can come alive any way he wants to. So so I'm seeing a devaluing of that death when you use the argument omnipotent, saying that God can do anything he wants to. So why does Christ's death mean anything to me? That's God, he can do anything he wants to. He dies, that doesn't mean anything. His death is meaningless. You see what I'm talking about?
I'm confused a little bit. What evidence would it be that it's meaningless?
It's meaningless because death to God is nothing. God is omnipotent. God doesn't really die. He's omnipotent.
But see, the secret is in what you said with omnipotence.
Yeah.
Did he say it means something? Because if he did, then it means everything. Because he'll make reality so.
Well, that's it. If you're asking for someone to have faith, then that person it's got to mean something to the person. Whether it means something to God or not, yeah, he's omnipotent. It doesn't mean But if we're looking to have some kind of connection to God, some kind of faith or something, then it needs to be meaningful for the individual to have faith. But if you're saying, but if God's death is not meaningful because God's omnipotent, then how can it be meaningful to me?
But you've repeated the phrase that
Yeah.
it's not meaningful.
Yeah.
And that sounds like something that you have decided. But if God, as you've declared he's omnipotent, has declared that it is meaningful, and if Jesus, I mean, experienced what he experienced, and God said that that was meaningful. I mean, John even says that anyone who comes to you and says that Christ did not come in the flesh is the deceiver and the antichrist. It was apparently very meaningful that it was in the flesh so that you knew that he was human and experienced it all. If the omnipotent being says, this is meaningful and this is the core of everything that I am, then nothing has more meaning. Nothing in reality has more meaning, and to say that it's meaningless is to deny reality itself.
What makes something meaningful? If it's not meaningful, it's only meaningful to God. It's not meaningful to me. You see, because God's omnipotent, saying it's meaningful implies that it's meaningful to some individual, or else it's only meaningful to God.
Not entirely, because I can say something is meaningful to me, but that doesn't mean that it's meaningful to you, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, whoever happens to be omnipotent by definition, if that omnipotent being says it is meaningful or something is meaningful, then it's objectively meaningful, even if subjectively you don't find meaning in it. See, this is an interesting problem that an atheist is going to struggle with, is the difference between objective truth and subjective truth. So in psychology, if I have subjective truth or good and evil, then it really boils down to whatever I feel like is subjectively true or whatever I don't feel like is not subjectively true. But I think we have to distinguish between what is actually meaningful would be, well, the death and resurrection of Jesus. More than anything else, more than any other story, that is the most meaningful of all stories because that is the omnipotent being's story itself. And if I find no meaning in that, it doesn't make it any less objectively true. Like a psychopath would not find any meaning in that no matter what story the Christian tells. Omnipotence or no omnipotence. They would say, well, that was stupid. In fact, I find no connection. That's repulsive. Ew. Why would you kill yourself? That makes no sense. Right? Why would you let yourself be killed? That's just stupid. Come on. But that doesn't mean it's any less meaningful. Like they're having a subjective experience and making what they consider to be an objective truth statement. But that objective truth statement is objectively false.
Are you trying to say the sacrifice, it's not a sacrifice? Are you trying to say it's not a sacrifice?
Yes.
I think he's trying to say, where's the sacrifice if it doesn't cost an omnipotent God anything?
Well, sure.
Like, is it loving?
I don't disagree with that. I mean, when you're talking about within space and time, God dying on a cross is an ultimate sacrifice. I don't disagree with that. Factually, from God's eye view, if he says it is a sacrifice, then it is the greatest of all sacrifices.
That's why that's not a fair argument, because you can say that about anything.
I have to say that about anything that an omnipotent being proclaims. But see, that's my point. When I say that it's difficult to really wrap your mind around omnipotence, to say something like, well, that's not a sacrifice, is to put yourself as the arbiter of omnipotence. You have decided that you are, I'm not hitting on you, but you, by saying that, have made the assumption that you are making the objective truth statement in this scenario. When in fact that's reversed. You are not omnipotent. The omnipotent being is. If the omnipotent being says it is a sacrifice, more so than anybody else's sacrifice, then it is objectively true, because he makes it so, by virtue of his own existence.
Now, when we think of grace, I feel like grace comes into this conversation. Grace is 100% God. It is a unilateral covenant. There's nothing that we do to deserve it, regardless if I feel if it's meaningful or not. I feel like I get caught in the same kind of discussion in my own head as it relates to what's my role in my salvation. And I want a piece of it. I want a piece of my salvation knowing I don't deserve any of it, and grace is 100% God. And I feel like the conversation when we start trying to think about meaningful, I feel like it's a piece of our flesh that just wants for the sacrifice, for me to say that I acknowledge the sacrifice is real as a result that I get to define it, then I have a piece of the grace. And I just feel like that's where the argument starts to lose. And that's when you start getting into conversations around election, right? In terms of, God's chosen and, what's your role in things. And you can go into a lot of philosophical and spiritual discussions.
I totally hear where you're going. It's ultimately asking the question of, like you said, our role in the story. I mean, the ultimate humility is to recognize, well, wow, I don't deserve this. I don't deserve any of this. Like, period. Why am I even here? And yet he picks you up and says, you're here because I said so. Did you choose me? Yeah, you did. Did you choose me because of that's the way I orchestrated it? Yes. Can both simultaneously exist? Yeah, because I said so. Now get up and do your job. Go love others like I have loved you. Build my kingdom like I told you to build in the very beginning. You now have the tools to do it. Here's the Spirit. Get to work. It's the ultimate in humility. It's the recognition of this is the King's story, and I am somehow a part of it, and I don't know why. It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, if I were making this story, it would look very different, and it'd probably fall apart 1,000 different ways. Even though I think I'm really smart, if I'm being honest with myself, the whole thing just would...
No one likes the argument of the answer of it, 'cause.
Yeah.
'Cause. Because.
Except parents. We like that argument because sometimes you just need to go leave me alone. Yeah, I'm with you, 100%. Yeah, it's a tough thing. Like, this is not easy, and this is not something that we like hearing. It's not like a nice little bow tie or whatnot. To find out that we're not the critical part of this equation, God is, and we get to be along for the ride, and He somehow thinks that we're the right people for the job. Like, I'm not the right person for anything. What are you talking about? You've made a clear miscalculation here, God. I mean, I'm maybe a little bit better than some of these Old Testament people, but if that's the grace, that's the humility, that's the wow. Yes.
It plays back a little bit on what was just said, but if it's ultimately a redemption and a reconciliation story, and God is God, and so He gets to define everything. It's a little tough, and I admit that He doesn't really care that I think it's a little tough, but it's a little tough that not everybody is going to flow through this reconciliation. And so some are going to go where you have the arrow going, and some are going someplace else. And if God is... Once again, I'll accept that He's omnipotent, but it's really tough to understand that not everybody gets to go where the arrow's going.
I understand what you're saying, and what happens to non-believers in the future theological topic is definitely a separate topic, because there are Christians that have answers all over the board. All throughout history, mind you. I mean, you'll see some that fall down one road of traditionalism, which would be the heaven-hell separation thing. You see some universalists. You will see some that would be annihilationists, which means hell is literally, well, you told God to go away. You just want to live your life and be done with Him when He's the source of life, so I guess you'll be part of the dust, like God said in the beginning. There are Christians that have been in all three camps for a long time. And I would say that is an extremely important discussion to have in light of the concept of God being omnipotent, and also in light of Scripture and the story and where's it going in the kingdom of God. But definitely out of we don't have another several hours tonight.
I guess
But thank you. That was a
Lorian
good comment.
I guess Lorian can book that for next year.
Do we have any more questions? What time is it? 7:43. We have a little bit of time left if you want to ask.
I guess bringing it back to, you were talking about God letting things happen, and I guess I have a harder time reconciling or looking at when God directs Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, which is a direct act and seems to contradict everything, the commandments that you get later, and that Isaac is innocent, and that it's extinguishing his promise. Well, how does that fit in the argument?
You, sir, are in the company of my favorite theologian of all time, Soren Kierkegaard. He wrote an
Suspension of the ethical.
Yeah, it's actually Fear and Trembling. He wrote an entire book on that, and it's such a fascinating meditation because this, by the way, and the book of Job are very similar in their takeaway points. Job doesn't quite have all the flowery language that Kierkegaard, like sometimes you'll just be reading Kierkegaard and be like, I understand nothing, but it's beautiful. I have no idea what he's talking about, but I've never seen someone arrange words this way. And I'm guilty of that from time to time. But I'll take the book of Job for this to a certain degree. Because when you go through Job, first of all, it's amazing to me that that was ever put in the Bible and left in the Bible. Like, what a horrible book to put in the Bible if you're trying to answer the question of evil. Because at the end of the day, you got a dude who didn't curse God, you're right, but he definitely said, you got to answer for what you're doing, God, because I didn't do anything wrong. And you know that's what he did because he got chewed out for 3 chapters. No less than 3. Where were you, Job, when I made everything? Oh, that's right. You weren't around. Where were you when I set the ocean? Oh, that's right. You didn't exist. Where were you when I set the land? Oh, that's right. You weren't even a gleam in your mother's eye. Shut up. And that's the story of Job. I mean, no kidding. Like, even the ending, which scholars are pretty universal on, that the ending where he gets, a new family and things are wonderful, like that was tacked on later. That wasn't an original ending to the story. But think about it. Okay, so he got new kids, but the old ones are still dead. This doesn't make things better unless you're a shallow, horrible human being. Like, is this the test? Okay, see, Job, you really weren't good. Like, what is happening here? And for some reason, they left it in the Bible. Like, this is the worst lesson you can possibly give if you're trying to solve this evil problem, isn't it? And yet, what do you take away from the story? Job broke. And when he broke, he went straight to God. And he didn't get the answer. He didn't get a good answer, or any answer for that matter. But somehow the experience somehow made it, I'm a mortal man, I'm sorry. I apologize, you're right. Somehow it was comforting in the process of just going to God and just kind of lashing out, in a sense, as opposed to, I don't believe this mess, never mind, God, you're not real, you're stupid. It was answer me, struggling with God in some ways. I mean, look what happened to Israel. Struggles with God, gets a new name, Jacob, right? That Jacob was not a good guy. David was not a good guy. Even his last words, if you haven't read them, you should. It's like, Solomon, you're a very wise king. He really screwed me over. You'll find a very bloody death for him. And then he died. Man after God's own heart. Like, God told him, you cannot build my temple. Your hands are way too bloody. You've killed way too many people. Coming from the guy who opened up the earth and swallowed Korah and his whole family. I mean, it's crazy trying to answer this question of evil with God. You're never going to get a great answer. Like, why did he call Abraham to sacrifice his son? We all know that's a bad idea. We all know that that's like anti-everything God stands for, and yet God's calling him to do that. The way that Kierkegaard approaches it is he tells the story in 4 different ways. And each way kind of is a meditation on, could it have gone down like this? Could it have, in different results? Like one of the meditations has, he never tells Isaac what's happening. He just kind of pretends because he wants Isaac to never know, so he doesn't hold it against God if something happens that saves him. And so as he's about to stab him, God sends the angel, and he's kind of, and Isaac, never knew the difference, except Isaac saw it, and his faith was never the same since, and he cursed God, and that kind of thing. Or in one of the stories, maybe it was one of those where Abraham decided, you cannot curse God. He cannot know that God called me to do this, so I'm going to act insane and tell him, I'm doing this, not the Almighty. And it's kind of like a meditation on, like, how does this go down? And how do you as Abraham even know that God's calling you to do this? Don't we call that psychopathy? Like, you're hearing voices at this point. I'm pretty sure schizophrenic falls into that category. And at the end of the day, there's no real good answer. Don't know. But maybe that's part of the point. He doesn't give us enough information to really make all of these determinations. We go through our lives day by day by day, and every single day that you're around, you're going to come across a point where you're like, I could search this Bible for 30 years, and I'm never going to find an answer to this question. I don't know how to approach this. It could be something as simple as, should I tell my kids about Santa Claus? To something in war ending the life of another human being. You know, it could be the big, the small, it doesn't matter. We don't have all of the information that we need. I don't care what the pastor says. There's a lot of stuff that we have to just kind of do it on the fly. And the best hope is, can I think like Christ enough to really start learning how to make good decisions and learning what the heart of God is? What would God do in this situation? You know what I'm talking about? And so at the end of the day, what if that actually is part of the process? What if we don't have enough information on purpose because this is a process and we have to grow into the kingdom? I mean, it is taken 2,000 years already, for crying out loud. Aren't we there yet? I come back to election day. Probably not. Right? Does that provide a non-answer to your question that you're
It
at least
does.
somewhat
I just
satisfied
think
with?
the difficult part is what we've been talking about is so many times God has let it happen, but here he's directing.
I don't have a good
It's
answer for you.
Right.
I mean, a lot of scholars have different takes on what that actually was implying, and there are some cultural connotations. So, for instance, you know, the firstborn son being the key to everything, that is the promise of God, God illustrating to Abraham. You keep thinking you don't have the faith to follow me, and yet you were fixing to sacrifice your son. Okay? Stop questioning yourself. You're on the right page. I know that you did those things with Sarah twice where you kept lying about her being your sister. Okay? Stop questioning yourself. I mean, those could be part of the context for all we know. We don't know.
Right.
But the readers probably knew because they didn't ask those questions. So whatever it was, it seems to be an accepted norm, at least in their mindset. In our mind, I mean, 4,000 years separated from that, I have no freaking clue. I can go through every scholarly opinion. They're all guesses at this point on that issue. Wish I had a better answer. Yes.
It's probably a proof God's not omnipotent because he didn't tell Sarah.
Oh man, not going to touch that. Yes.
My first question is, if you make the argument that what happens to you always reflects God's goodness, does that hold up logically? And then the second was, is the story of Job like a demonstration of God's omnipotence? Like basically he's asking Job all these questions which say, you aren't omnipotent and I am. I mean, is that making the same case you just made?
God makes that argument all throughout Scripture, actually. So, for instance, the fact that it starts in the beginning when God creates the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering above the waters. Seriously, water existed before water existed? What does this even mean? It's actually the waters of chaos. It's a ancient medieval notion of, here's the chaotic mess that the gods can sort of control, but no one can really control it, and it's personified by the sea. So if you go through, the omnipotent claim first starts off with, God controls the chaos. And everyone's going, whoa, hold up. He's taking the chaos and doing all this stuff? No way, false. Which God did it? Come on, there's a lot of stuff happening with lots of gods, but you're not going to tell me it's one monotheistic God that does this. That's already an omnipotent claim. Why does he flood the earth with water? Because he's actually showing he controls the chaos and he'll start over if he has to. It doesn't matter. Why does Jonah run to the sea? He could have just run to Egypt. It would have been perfectly acceptable. You know, if you're running away from God, you're going the opposite direction. He goes in the sea, to the chaos. Because who can control the chaos? God sends the waves, and Jonah's like, throw me overboard. It's not kindness that causes Jonah to say, throw me overboard. It's, God's not going to grab me once I get into the chaos. Except, then God sends a chaos monster to go get him, which is what they would have called it at that time. spits him back up on land, and God says, why don't you go do what I told you to do? I could do this all day. And then, is it any wonder that in Revelation, when God's kingdom is made fully manifest, one of the statements that he makes at the end of all of that is so perplexing to us. It says, and the sea was no more. In his kingdom, there is no room for the chaos left. His kingdom has pushed it all into order, under his domain, under his order, and we are chief among making that happen by the power of the Holy Spirit. It's a story of God's victory. And so, when you're talking about God making omnipotent claims, man, it's everywhere in Scripture. In fact, it's thematic throughout all of Scripture. Taking these people who were in Egypt as polytheists, they weren't monotheists, and moving them into a monotheism. I am that I am. Like, you're seeing mind-blowing stuff happening to these people at this point in time, theologically, philosophically, all of it. Everything is omnipotent play on God's part. Why does he make them, when they're in Egypt, Pharaoh's ready to let them go multiple times, and God's like, no, you're not ready yet. Harden his heart. Okay, got the next one coming. If you look at the list, he systematically deconstructs the power of every one of their major gods, culminating in Pharaoh himself. He can't even protect his own son, right? Ra, the one right before that, it's darkness. Even Ra can't save you from me. He doesn't let it stop. God doesn't let it stop. Why? Because he wasn't done yet. You see? It's written everywhere. And as you start to read it over and over again, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, he is not messing around. And Job, yes, Job is part of that too. But God's love and justice and mercy is everywhere too. Like, you'll never be more amazed than when you start looking at God's mercy in the Old Testament. Like, even to the point of he seems to be far more concerned about how foreigners are treated than how Jews are treated. Like, it's crazy how concerned he was with the poor, even in the Old Testament. It's nuts. He actually cares about his creation and the marginalized, the people who struggle, the people who need this help. Blessed are they, Old and New Testament. So, I hope that answers your question.
Does the good one hold up, or is it that you just can't define anything based on good because it's indefinable?
When you're trying to define evil and good, you're not going to find an atheist who can hold to a conclusion or a definition that doesn't boil down to I or we prefer it.
We got time for one more, if anyone wants to cap us off.
I think I scared everybody off.
Right? Well, thank you, Chris. Let's thank Chris.